You do not have the right to target civilians for murder or abduction. Those are war crimes, and I think they're morally reprehensible. Controlling millions of people who lack basic human rights is a fundamental affront to the political principle of equality under the law and to the theological principle of equality under God. Jews are safer living alongside Palestinians who have a voice in government than living alongside Palestinians who are locked out of government.
What risks do you think Jews must take now in order to live in accordance with that moral center, even if it means stepping outside the security paradigms that dominate Israeli and diaspora politics? All right, welcome back to Brave New Something, and this one is an exciting one. So those of us who are actively Jewish and of a certain vintage and liberal political persuasion, we share a common identity in political history. We were collectively raised in the shadow of the Holocaust, where many of our community believed that the bedrock principles of human rights, equality, and internationally mandated normative standards, those were really the best ways to ensure that our own community's future's prosperity was ensured. For us, the safety of all meant the safety of us. And so those constraints were the guardrails against our people's and other people's future turmoil and persecution. For those of us of this vintage, the two-state solution, that is to say Jews and Palestinians living alongside one another in separate national homelands, that wasn't just the desired political outcome. That was the only real feasible solution that would permit two people to live alongside one another without one subjugating their rights and privileges to another. And to our mind, it was the natural way of the liberal order that human rights and self-determination could coexist alongside the preservation of a Jewish state, which for us was incredibly important. For those Jews like myself who relate to that time and place, the late 1990s and the early 2000s, they were really quite definitional. Those years saw Israel engage in a peace process that pitted liberal elements of Jewish society, that pushed for concessions, against conservative ones that believed that peace would never be accepted by the other side because of their stated goal to destroy Israel. And as the collective narrative now goes, at least the Jewish narrative, Israel went out of its way during the peace process to offer Palestinians a homeland. There were certain restrictions. Certainly a Palestinian right of return was not proffered. The Israelis were going to retain East Jerusalem, but 98% of the West Bank, 100% of Gaza was to be returned. And the Palestinians, in the Jewish mind, rejected the offer, didn't counter with an alternative. And in the Jewish consciousness, what that meant was that conservatives were proven correct, and the Israeli left collapsed for really a generation. Likud and its companions that formed the conservative bloc of Israeli life, they've been in power ever since. Labor, the traditional bastion of the left, has all but disappeared from the political scene. The past 20 years have proven lonely for those who continue to believe in the Jewish liberal ethos that we were raised in. Few have been willing to stand up, challenge the government, and more importantly, the moral position of the Jewish state, in part because many of us don't believe that there's been an alternative to stand up for. If you're operating within a political belief system where everyone believes your opponents are not prepared to negotiate in good faith, well, then what position can you really espouse other than a militarized opposition? But those 20 years have been, for 20 years really, there have been those who have called for a counterbalance to that paradigm. Those thinkers were at first alone, and they're now a growing force. And they're constructing really what is a new dialogue predicated upon the realization that our own Jewish moral legitimacy requires actions that are vastly different in nature than those being taken by the present political actors. Peter Beinart is a force in that movement, and he has for years taken unpopular positions in his own Jewish world in an effort to carve out new space and a social permission structure for alternative paths going forward. Peter is the former editor of the New Republic. He's a prolific writer and thinker. He's frequently published in major international medias and is the editor-at-large of Jewish Currents. But most importantly, Peter is a proud religious Jew who believes passionately in a Jewish future in Israel, and he joins me here today. Peter, I'm so grateful. Welcome to Brave New Something.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Those were
No.
mine.
I think that absolutely no. I appreciate the kind words, and I think there's a lot in the way you frame this that makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay. So Peter, maybe I can just jump right into the questions.
Sure.
And I usually start with a softball, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to jump into the hard.
That's fine.
So, Peter, listening to your work over the years, what's always struck me is how you've insisted that really Jewish ethics can't simply be reactive, that they
Mhm.
have to come from somewhere deeper, from our own history, from our own moral tradition. And I really want to start there. Looking back, do you think that the Jewish moral center that many of us were raised with, rooted in the Holocaust, human rights, liberal order, has that been lost? And if so, when did you first start to see that shift?
I mean, I think today I would say that I think there was a contradiction at the heart of it. I don't think I would have said that in the past. I don't think I saw it that way in the past, but I think today I do. And I think the contradiction, and many other people have kind of came to this conclusion before I did, I think is basically between the way in which most diaspora Jews came to believe that what they believed in the countries in which they lived was the principle of neutral states that would provide equality under the law to everyone, irrespective of their race or religion or ethnicity. And simultaneously, especially heightened after 1967, the way in which most of those diaspora Jews and their leaders became very, very strongly identified with the idea of a Jewish state in Israel that was based on very, very different principles. The principle of a state that had a special obligation to one religious ethnic group, and indeed gave legal supremacy in various different forms to that group. Now, I think at various times earlier in my life, I would have thought I would have been more inclined to justify this tension, to say, well, I understand the reasons for it. It's necessary. We can minimize the tension in Israel between these competing principles. But over time, I've come to feel that the contradiction to me seems more stark, and that I felt the need to essentially choose. Do I believe, especially in given the rise of global ethno-nationalism, including the United States, of people who essentially want to make other countries more like Israel, right? America as a white Christian state, I felt kind of forced to choose. Do I believe in the principle of equality under the law as the basis for legal systems, or do I believe in group supremacy? And so I've chosen equality under the law.
Okay, and to your mind, equality under the law, of course, requires all people broadly to enjoy the same rights and the
Yes.
same obligation, have the same obligations, but doesn't pit one group of people or individuals against the other.
Yes.
Okay, but of course, the reality in Israel presently is somewhat different, and people do live under different systems of justice, and they live under different geographic powers. And as a result, there has been conflict that the whole world is well aware of. Presently, Israel does see its very existence at stake. The Palestinians believe the same, and the two sides are very much pitted one against the other. I hope I'm not saying anything here controversial. This seems to me to be obvious to any listener. Um, and the problem that I'd like you to expound on is the reality that now stems or what happens stemming from that very reality. Um, you know, what I've seen over the past 20 years is the Jewish side constantly saying we do not have peace partners on the other side, therefore we have to take our own actions. It's a and in doing that, I don't think Jews properly, maybe they have, but a lot of us haven't really thought through that, because what that means is that our moral obligations are entirely contingent upon whether or not the Palestinians can prove themselves as peace partners. Do you think tying Jewish ethics to the behavior of our adversaries has hollowed out our own moral core? Maybe I can ask an easier
Sure.
question. You can ask
Right.
either of the two. Is there a danger in defining Jewish legitimacy only through the existential threats and the actions of those who wish us harm?
Yes. I mean, I don't, I think that Jews and anybody else has the right to judge Palestinian behavior. And there are things that I think are moral, that one can argue were strategic mistakes. And also, I think one can argue are war crimes and morally reprehensible that various different Palestinian groups have done at various points. So I think that's totally legitimate. I think the heart of but I think there are some very basic problems with the idea that Israel wanted to give the Palestinians a sovereign state, but the Palestinians just wouldn't accept one for whatever reasons, right? I mean, one of the problems with this is that it simply cannot account for the growth in settlements, right? I mean, whatever you want to blame Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, Hamas for, they are not responsible for the inexorable growth of settlements in the West Bank, which by any honest, any honest appraisal makes the idea of a contiguous Palestinian state much, much harder. And it's not just that Israel allows Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank. Israel, in many ways, subsidizes Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank by making in housing, in industry, in agriculture, in a whole series of ways, it's cheaper to live in the West Bank. You can't blame the Palestinians for that, right? The second thing is that Israel has since Netanyahu came back to power in 2009, has basically had an uninterrupted period now of 15 years or so, led by governments that don't support the idea of a Palestinian state. So, I mean, we can get into what happened between Barak and Arafat and what happened between Olmert and Abbas. I think that the common mainstream Jewish understanding of those negotiations is in significant ways flawed. But even if it weren't flawed, how on earth are you going to argue that Benjamin Netanyahu has been trying to give Palestinians a state, right? The man is basically screams as loud as he can that he opposes the idea of a Palestinian state.
Yes, but if I were to play devil's advocate and
Yeah.
position for Israel for a second, if you can imagine what sole conservative governance would look like here in North America, and I think we can, and we're seeing some of it play out in the States. I mean, the agenda is markedly different than when ultimately you have pushback from a viable political party that's saying, hold tight, let's move. And the reason that we started this discussion with the context of the 1990s and the 2000s is because something very definitive did take place. Now, I'm going to push back on you. You may not believe that what was on offer is the Israeli position, but the Israeli consensus is that there was a firm rejection of a peace effort. And the push into the settlements, which was taking place, in fairness, before the peace negotiations, I'm not trying to say it hasn't been happening before, happened with gusto. The settlements that actually came in, that started dividing up the territory, that started making two-state solutions absolutely impossible, took place once there was a crystallized consensus amongst the Israeli population that there was no partner to deal with. And I think that it behooves us to point that particular point out. It doesn't in any way negate the fact that clearly the political powers that be are working against the two-state solution. They have said so fairly implicitly, some said so implicitly at this time. But it does provide the explanation for what has taken place over the past 15 years.
Yeah, I disagree with parts of that. I actually don't think that you only see the growth of settlements that make a Palestinian state impossible kind of in response. I think if you look at, for instance, the settlement growth continues throughout the 1990s. It doesn't stop at all, even under Rabin and then later Barak. It continues. If you look at a settlement like Ariel, for instance, which was the most difficult sticking point in the Olmert Abbas negotiations, that doesn't start in response to Palestinian rejectionism. There, I think, has been a very strong, consistent pattern of Israel building and expanding settlements throughout, and many of the settlements, even the ones that are in the Jewish community often considered consensus settlements, are actually significant problems for the possibility of Palestinian contiguity. Efrat, for instance, or Ariel kind of basically cuts deep into the northern West Bank, cutting off the northern cities of Kalkilia and Tulkarem for the rest of the West Bank. Efrat is on the major north-south artery of the spine of a Palestinian state. I also think that the truth is, as I read the history of what happened, let's say between Barak and Arafat, 2000, 2001, is that it's not true that Israel offered the Palestinians everything they wanted, even putting aside refugee return. The Palestinians wanted a sovereign state on virtually all of the West Bank. What Israel had in mind was far, far less than that. First of all, it was not going to be a truly sovereign state. Israel was going to have control of the airspace and the telecommunication spectrum. Israel was going to have an indefinite presence in the troops in the Jordan Valley. Israel was going to annex 8 or 10% of the West Bank, and give the Palestinians 1% in return, right? So, and there were going to be land corridors that Israel could use if it needed them, that would cut across the West Bank to get them from Israel proper to the border with Jordan. So there was a very different idea of what a Palestinian state would look like. What I would say is the Israeli view was essentially a state minus, something that wasn't truly a sovereign state and wasn't truly on all of the West Bank. So, and I think that's where a lot of the establishment Jewish discourse is just at odds with actually the scholarly record here.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Peter, historical record aside and politics aside, we are where we are. We're in a position where the vast majority of Israelis are supporting um, the existing status quo, or at least the directional status quo.
Yes.
And we now have a position where two-state solution sounds great, but is further away from being a reality than it ever has been in my lifetime.
Yeah.
What does that mean to the Jewish core? What does that mean to the Jewish identity in Israel?
Well, I think the first thing I want to note is just that when we use the term Israeli, I think it's in some ways a very slippery phrase, right? For this reason. Um, Most of the Palestinians under Israeli control can't become citizens of the state. So we wouldn't call them Israelis, even though they essentially live within the state of Israel. And even the 20%, even the minority of Palestinians who have citizenship in Israel, we call Arab Israelis, are very rarely referred to in these conversations as Israelis. So when people say the Israeli population moved way to the right after the Second Intifada, or most Israelis reject the Second Intifada, we essentially use the term in ethno-national terms as to be referring only to Jewish Israelis. And this to me is part of the problem with the whole basis of Israeli politics, in which even those Palestinians who have citizenship are essentially delegitimized as political actors. And I think it goes back to the question that you asked earlier about the politics of the country, right? Israel moving to the right. If there were to be a genuine left in Israel that could really contest for power, its political base would be Palestinian citizens of Israel. Just like in the Democratic Party, the base of the Democratic Party is Black Americans. Because if you have an equality-oriented politics of the left, people who suffer the most inequality are you going to be your strongest natural constituency. But Palestinian citizens are not, even though they can vote, are not really considered legitimate actors in the Israeli political system, right? It's very difficult. A government that would rely on them for its coalition majority would not generally be considered a legitimate government. So this is part of the problem with, to me, with the entire idea of ethno-nationalism, which we have to put on the table as we try to assess Israeli politics.
Well, that those are fair points all, but the voting public guides where Israel's history and politics goes.
Right.
And as a result, the voting public, which has been in control, regardless of what constitutes that bloc, has
Mhm.
moved Israel to a position, and that position is now the reality where
Yeah.
all people find themselves, regardless of whether they can vote or not. And the
Yeah.
question is, in that reality, how do we anchor our Jewish values and where do we go from here?
Right. So look, there is no consensus on what constitutes Jewish values. As you know, our texts, the rabbis compare the Talmud to the ocean, to the sea, right? So there are many, many different voices. I would never claim that there is one that the principle of equality is the only or even the core Jewish value. There are many, many, many Jewish values, and our texts speak in radically different voices. So all I can say are those voices within the tradition that speak most clearly to powerfully to me. And to me, in my Jewish values, the central idea that God creates all human beings equally in God's image, and that happens before the covenant with Abraham and before the story of Bnei Yisrael, before the Jewish story, with universal human beings, Adam, Eve, Noah, the people of the Tower of Babel, etc. That's ultimately, for me, the foundational lens through which I view everything, human equality. And so from that perspective, controlling millions of people who lack basic human rights, the right to be a citizen of the country in which they live, is a fundamental affront to the political principle of equality under the law and to the theological principle of equality under God. And so to me, it's a very, very profound moral and spiritual crisis to have Israel not only holding people under these conditions of legal inferiority, but in fact killing them in large numbers.
I understand. So let's assume then that the moral center that you've described, as you say, there's many moral centers, but that there's a large component of people who maintain and adhere to that moral center, the moral center that ultimately wants to live in what we have defined as a free and liberal society post World War II and bring that to their cherished homeland, to Israel, and that they care about, that they want to that they want the best for. What risks do you think Jews must take now in order to live in accordance with that moral center? even if it means stepping outside the security paradigms that dominate Israeli and diaspora politics?
Right. So I guess I would answer it in a couple of ways. I think that the view that I hold, which is that wherever Israeli Jews and Palestinians live alongside one another, they should be equal under the law, is considered to many Jews as an incredibly risky and even reckless thing to advocate. That it puts Jews at grave risk, right? I fundamentally disagree with that. I fundamentally believe that Jews are safer living alongside Palestinians who have a voice in government than living alongside Palestinians who are locked out of government. Because and I think political science literature bears this out, when you are locked out of government, when you have no means of petitioning government by having the vote, by having citizenship, it's in those conditions people are more likely to take up arms against the state. And that's why I think Palestinian citizens of Israel are less likely to commit acts of violence than Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, if you believe that, as I do, then I think the impetus for Jews in the United States and Canada is to be willing to risk some degree of social opprobrium within our communities, and even some potentially professional costs in order to stand up for the principles that we believe in, recognizing that that many of the people that we admire in other moments and times in history were people who were willing to pay some kind of price for standing up for their beliefs. I like to remind people that Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is now revered in the United States among American Jews for having marched in Selma, that when he came to the South, he was met by a group of Southern rabbis who said to him, "You live in New York. You don't know what it's actually like to be a Jew here. You are putting us at risk." When he advocated against the Vietnam War, that was a very unpopular position among many, many rabbis in the United States at that time. And so I think we have to be willing, if we want to walk in those shoes, we have to be willing to risk something.
Well, I think that the sentiment that I'm hearing amongst my Jewish friends, my colleagues, and I would be remiss if I did not mention the word anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head in North America in a significant way, and not only North America, globally. Whether in reaction to what's happening in the Middle East or sui generis, I mean, it certainly was there before, and now more people are attenuated to it than ever before. I have friends who mentioned to me that they are purchasing individual security. They're afraid for their kids to go to school. And the reason I bring this up is because it is inevitably harder to ultimately ascribe rights to others when you feel that your own actual personal safety is at risk. In fact, we see that on a national level. We saw how America reacted after 2001. We saw how Israel reacts after October 7th. And on a personal level, it's exceptionally hard to convince Jews that they need to be giving up legitimacies and rights and everything else when they themselves feel that the very essence of who they are is under attack in a collective manner across the globe. How would you speak to those people? What would you say? Because I think that that is a valid concern, and moreover, it's something that goes to your core as a human being, creating fear, and fear is very hard to dissipate when you're trying to just think logically, well, this looks good in abstract.
Yes, and I also think it's important for us to remind ourselves that it's the norm for people who become accustomed to systems of legal supremacy to associate the principle of equality with death or with subjugation. That was the way almost all white South Africans felt, most white Southerners. It's not unique to Jews to see that. I would say, in terms of the question of anti-Semitism, I think we should distinguish between two different kinds of anti-Semitism. The first is the anti-Semitism of the right, which I think is connected to the potential collapse of liberal democracy. And this anti-Semitism is usually paired with other forms of hostilities towards outsider groups: Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBT, right? And I think that we have to join with other groups in supporting the principle of liberal democracy and supporting the principle of treating people equally. And I actually think in the United States, the overwhelming focus of the organized American Jewish community on defending Israel actually makes that kind of work much harder, right? You think about how much more energy America's most powerful Jewish organizations are putting into fighting against, quote unquote, the delegitimization of Israel than they are to putting in to fighting Donald Trump. And oftentimes they're making common cause with Trump supporters because Trump supporters are very strong supporters of Israel. So AIPAC is literally giving money to people who supported the January 6th insurrection to try to overthrow liberal democracy. On the left, the kind of anti-Semitism that we see that conflates Jews with Israel, that basically says, we hate Israel, and therefore we're going to hold Jews responsible for that, right? I think the way to respond to that is to be very clear that Jews are not responsible for what Israel does. Many Jews choose to be supporters of Israel, but it is a choice that Jews make. Jews are no more responsible for what Israel does than Chinese Americans or Chinese Canadians are responsible for what the People's Republic of China does, right? And that's why it's wrong to hold Jews responsible for what happens in Israel. The problem is that our leading organizations can't make that argument coherently because they say that to be a Zionist, to support Israel, is inherent in being Jewish. I think that claim, that link, idea that there's an inherent connection, actually puts Jews at greater risk because it essentially makes Jews responsible for what Israel does, when we need to make the point that Jews are not responsible for what Israel does and that it's wrong to blame them for it.
You know, I know I'm a podcast host here and I'm supposed to say something in response to what you've just said there, but honestly, I'd like to think about what you said. I know that that's not de rigueur while you're hosting a podcast and to say, hey, I'm going to think about this and perhaps get back to you the way I do my business, but I'd prefer not to actually speak about that. I'd prefer to just think it over and contemplate what you just said there. Let me instead turn my attention, because you've been very generous with your time and I only have 5 minutes left. But I'd like to turn our attention to the future. Um, I am concerned because, as I said, the current paradigm, political paradigm, historical paradigm, and socioeconomic paradigm of Israel and the diaspora that has taken place now for more than a generation, for almost 20 years. That means that young kids who have been born into Jewish families and that feel passionate about Israel have known only one sort of politics, have known only one sort of direction. For young Jews who don't share the same memory of the Oslo years, for the younger Jews who have only known Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister, with brief exceptions, how can we help them see Jewish survival, Jewish morality as inseparable, and start creating new paradigms that allow them to explore their own politics over their lifetime?
That's a great question. I mean, I would start by thinking about the way we talk and teach about 1948, right? I think that it's important that young Jews be able to understand why most Jews around the world saw Israel as a vital refuge and indeed as a miracle, right? To be able to imagine what Israel meant for someone coming out of a displaced persons camp in Europe whose family had been destroyed in the Shoah. I think many young Jews do have some sense of that, but it's important that that be understood. And it's important that people around the world even understand that, right? It's understandable that so many Jews were so drawn to the idea of Zionism and the creation of Israel, especially in the wake of the Shoah. But it's also so essential that we understand what Israel's creation meant for Palestinians, because this is really, for Palestinians, absolutely at the heart of their understanding of reality. And it's not a story they've made up, right? You very rarely find a Palestinian whose family was not expelled or at least radically dislocated by what happened in 1948. Palestinians in 1947 were 66% of the population. They lived on the large majority of the land. And Israel's creation, even before May 1948, even in the early months of 1948, Israel was systematically expelling large numbers of Palestinians from their homes, ultimately perhaps more than half of the Palestinian population expelled. And that is a trauma that for Palestinians has never, not just not been rectified, it's never really even been acknowledged, right? By the organized American Jewish community, by Israel, by the United States. And so we have to be able to, I think, help young American Jews imagine what Israel means for the person who comes from a displaced persons camp, but also to realize that that person who came from the displaced persons camp was likely given the key to the home of a Palestinian who had themselves been expelled. And we need to be able to imagine what it was like for that Palestinian, Israel's creation as well.
Fair enough. And to your mind, then, that greater construct, that greater understanding, will provide for more flexibility on the Israeli side to explore different options and to ultimately come to different conclusions?
Yeah, I think first of all, when one thinks about the question of anti-Zionism, right? When you think about the Palestinian experience, the more time you spent talking to Palestinians, listening to Palestinians, the easier it is to understand why Palestinians could be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic, right? That anti-Zionism is really the natural product of their experience because the creation of the state starts with their mass expulsion, right? Not to mention the things that Israel has done since then, like holding millions of Palestinians in the West Bank under military law. And I think that we need to be able to have that empathy, where so much of establishment Jewish discourse now is basically involved in trying to discredit or delegitimize or even sometimes criminalize Palestinians or people who speak based on their appreciation of the Palestinian experience.
My final question to you is to turn the tables just a little. The reason that I've approached this from the perspective of Israel and Jews and what Israel needs to do and Jews need to do is because I believe that your moral center should not be reliant upon the people who you see as opponents. It should stem from something deeper. And if you're reliant upon the people who you perceive as adversaries, then you're playing in the same field and you cannot express who you are. But it's a fair point that we are dancing with another partner. I say we as Jews, Israelis, people who care about Israel. What obligations do they have? I mean, clearly, whatever obligations they have were clearly violated by October 7th in the most heinous of ways.
Yeah.
What obligations do the Palestinians have to Israel? And I know that's a tough question to ask, as the past 2 years have led to mass displacement and all the things that have been mentioned. But honestly, there are two sides to this. And where do the Palestinians need to go in order to um, start working towards the end, the natural end of two states for two peoples with separate equalities?
Right. So there are two sides, but it's important to acknowledge that there's a radical power disparity between these two sides. One side has a nuclear armed state. The other side is a stateless people, right?
Fair enough, Peter. But in fairness, you'll note that I gave 25 minutes to the Israeli side and
Yes,
5 minutes to so we're
yes.
allocating appropriately.
Fair enough. And I'm not saying that I don't believe just because people are weaker or because they lack freedom that they should not be, that they are exempt from moral judgment. I don't believe that, right? I believe in the principle of international law. Under international law, even if you are under occupation, as Palestinians, I believe, are, you do not have the right to target civilians for murder or abduction, as Hamas clearly did on October 7th, and indeed, as Hamas did in the 1990s with suicide bombings, as it did during the Second Intifada. Those are war crimes, and I think they're morally reprehensible. So I think that Palestinians should adhere to this principle that you cannot target civilians. I also think that Palestinians should lay out the principle of equality, which means that Jewish Israelis have the right to live equally alongside Palestinians. That Jewish Israelis should not be expelled, should not be pushed out of their homes. That I believe Israeli Jews should have the right to live everywhere in what we call the land of Israel, including the West Bank, including Gaza, just equally under conditions of legal equality. I think that the one of the challenges we have is that when Palestinians have actually acted in ways that I think are more consistent with those principles, they have not really gotten very much credit for it, right? So one of the things that you hear often in Jewish discourse is, why don't the Palestinians try nonviolence, right? But if you look at the way that the United States and Israel and American Jewish organizations respond to Palestinian nonviolence, it's generally to try to criminalize that nonviolence, right? So it's not like people say, oh, the Palestinians are trying a nonviolent boycott in the tradition of apartheid South Africa. Good for them. It's that we try to pass laws that basically mean that you can't have employment in the state governments in the United States if you boycott Israel. When Palestinians did a largely nonviolent march in 2018 in Gaza, they were systematically shot by snipers who Israel put on the fence separating Gaza from Israel proper. And so I think we do have the right to say these are the moral principles that Palestinians should abide by. But I think it's hollow if we still end up punishing Palestinians even when they do the things that we supposedly want them to do.
I understand where you're going. I also believe that there is a reticence, and by the way, this doesn't just extend to the Palestinian side. I hear it on the Jewish side as well. But there's a reticence presently to accept the basic legitimacies of the aspirations of a homeland. from the Palestinians to the Jews and to the Israelis, and more from the Israelis and Jews to the Palestinians. I almost feel like what is required, I'm just going to leave it at this,
Mm.
is dialogue where everyone comes in signing almost a paper. Like when we have these dialogues that basically says, I accept your legitimacy to a homeland and you accept mine. Because
Mm.
once you have that dialogue, then you have a framework within which you can define. And I feel that more and more people are being pulled apart to a point where they are not even able to agree to those simple facts. I hope that constructively we can find a way forward both for Jews and Israelis, but also particularly for Palestinians to basically just acknowledge the legitimacy of everyone's claims such that these dialogues can actually take place and that we can find our way forward to a better, brighter future.
Yeah, I have no problem with the idea of acknowledging two homelands as long as it's within the spirit of the principle of legal equality, so that your homeland doesn't entitle you to legal supremacy.
Yeah, and you've been very clear on that point, and in your previous interviews, Peter, I'm really very grateful. I know how busy you are. I know how in demand your thoughts on these sections are. I also know how controversial it is for many people. For those people who have listened to this and are uncomfortable by some of the ideas espoused, good. I think change comes from people hearing other positions that are different than their own. At the same time, I think there's a lot of work to be done on all sides, and new positions are sought and needed in order to bring forth a brighter future for all people involved. To the extent, Peter, that you're able to open minds or at least have people consider alternatives to what is going forward, I'm grateful. And I thank you sincerely for being a guest here on Brave New Something. It's meant a great deal to me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for watching, guys. Please hit that like, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single second of our content. Looking forward to seeing you guys at our next interview. Everyone, take care.